Hello and welcome back. So today's lecture review explores how altitude and heat stress are going to affect human performance, a lot of environmental impacts on the body. This one is a fun chapter. As you can see here, it's going to be things like VO₂max reductions, red blood cell adaptations, and all the way on to mechanisms of heat dissipation and the use of the wet bulb globe temperature in endurance events. Again, Bloom's taxonomy is the pyramid that we are going to use. Here we go. Now this first question may just seem like numbers, but these are very useful reference numbers to better understand and appreciate the next question. It's really going to set the stage. So technically your first question, the summit of Mount Everest is approximately how many meters high with inspired O2 of what percent? It's a very good reference number to be aware of. Is it 6, 7, 8, or 9,848 meters? And what is the percent O2? And this one is 8,848 meters and 7% O2. Now, while the fraction of O2 is unchanged, the barometric pressure is so low that the effective inspired O2 is really only about 7%. So here's actually the real question. So at the summit of Everest, 8,000 meters, the fraction of inspired O2, the FiO2, remains the same at 21%, yet effective inspired PO2 is dramatically reduced, which physiological consequence most directly explains the severe reduction in VO₂max at this altitude. Is it A, decreased mitochondrial oxidative enzymes, B, reduced arterial oxygen content, C, decreased hemoglobin concentration, D, reduced muscle capillary density, or E, decreased lactate clearance? So this takes you straight from just a straight remember question all the way up to the analyze. And the answer is B. So the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere still remains at 21%. But at the summit of Everest, the barometric pressure is much lower. It's about 253 millimeters mercury, which is only about 1/3 of the 760 millimeters mercury at sea level. So because there's so much less total air pressure, the oxygen molecules are more spread out. They're less dense up in the rarefied air of Everest. That means while you're still inhaling 21% oxygen, you are receiving far fewer oxygen molecules. And due to that low inspired PO2, arterial O2 sat is lower, which reduces your potential VO₂max because VO₂max is primarily limited by oxygen delivery, which is your heart pumping, but in Everest, it's a little different. And question 2, which mechanism is the most important for human heat dissipation during exercise? Is it radiation, conduction, convection, evaporation, or blood redistribution? Straight up remember question, this is evaporation. Humans rely primarily on evaporative cooling, especially during high intensity or hot conditions. During exercise, your metabolic heat production in the body rises dramatically, and evaporative cooling becomes the dominant mechanism because dry heat loss mechanisms cannot offset the large internal heat load in your body. And I've felt this living in San Diego and just experiencing the heat, especially when you go on some climbs, it gets pretty hot. Question 3. Above core body temperature, the only effective means of heat dissipation is radiation, conduction, convection, evaporation, or respiration. So it's a slightly different question, slightly different wording, but it's evaporation once again. So when ambient temperature outside exceeds your skin temperature, evaporation is really the sole avenue for heat loss. When environmental temperature exceeds your skin temperature, things like radiation, conduction, convection, they actually reverse direction, meaning the body gains heat, doesn't lose heat, and that leaves evaporation as the only pathway that can remove said heat. So really question 2 is about environmental physics when it's hotter than you are. Question 3 here is more about metabolic physiology when you're producing, well, sometimes massive internal heat and have to dissipate. Question 4. Normobaric hypoxia differs from hypobaric hypoxia because what? Does it have lower oxygen fraction, reduced barometric pressure, simulates altitude via reduced PO2 without pressure change, causes greater erythropoiesis, or is just flat out ineffective? And this one is C. It simulates altitude via reducing the PO2 without changing the pressure. Hence, normobaric hypoxia. It lowers your inspired PO2 without reducing the barometric pressure. Question 5, which types of events are most impaired at high altitude? Is it sprint events, strength training events, endurance events, skill-based sporting events, or powerlifting? This one is endurance events. I was just thinking about powerlifting like on the top of Everest. That was funny. Endurance performance relies heavily on aerobic metabolism and therefore is, of course, most sensitive to reduced oxygen availability. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Question 6, why is the wet bulb globe temperature very useful for endurance events? Is it that it measures only air temperature? Does it account for humidity, radiant heat, and air movement? Predicts VO2 max decline? Measures dehydration directly? Or replaces core temperature? I tried to set you up for this one, pretty straightforward. Yes, that's the whole point of wet bulb globe temperature. It integrates multiple environmental variables to better estimate heat stress risk during prolonged activity. It's a really neat little gadget. All right, moving up to apply now. Why does the same submaximal workload at sea level represent a higher percent VO2 max at altitude? Is it that absolute VO2 increases, the VO2 max decreases, muscle efficiency declines, lactate production increases, or cardiac output increases? And this one is B, VO2 max decreases. Because VO2 max is reduced, any fixed workload therefore consumes a greater fraction of your maximal capacity. In case you were sleeping back at the start with the bonus question, why does VO2 max decrease at altitude? Is it reduced mitochondrial density, lower arterial PO2, reduced capillary density, decreased muscle mass, or increased fatigue perception? And this one is lower arterial PO2. That lower inspired PO2 reduces arterial O2 content, which limits your maximal oxygen delivery. I love fun facts, and another fun fact here related to physiology. At the summit of Everest, your VO2 max is estimated to be less than 25% of your sea level values. Even in elite climbers, you cannot get over this. You can't beat this. It is really tough air up there. Question 9. Long-term altitude exposure generally causes cardiac output to what? Decrease progressively, decrease at rest and exercise, remain elevated permanently, increase only during maximal exercise, or just become all-out irrelevant. And this one is decrease at rest and exercise. After acclimatization, cardiac output declines towards the quote-unquote new normal as your oxygen carrying capacity increases. So it's kind of a funny way to think about that, but this is what happens. And question 10, a level 5 question. Which strategy is generally most effective for lowlanders seeking altitude benefits? I have been trying to keep these questions totally clean without any pop culture or anything, but I had to oppose the lowlanders to the highlanders. This goes back to like the 1980s when I was growing up in the movie Highlander. People really say lowlanders if you are a highlander. All right, is it live low, train high? Is it live high, train high? Is it live high, train low? Is it training in hypobaric tents, or is it training near sea level? Just pause and think for a minute, but this one generally follows a lot of the main literature out there. This is the whole live high, train low concept. The living high, training low allows the hypoxic exposure while still preserving really high quality training sessions at sea level. The live high, train low still really has the most evidence-based research out there for boosting your hemoglobin mass in your body and still your VO2 max. The live high, train high fails in that you can't maintain the same intensity when you're training up high. Think training at Everest, it's very hard to do, so you actually get a detraining effect, which really stinks. The live low, train high is really for the hypoxic effect. You're not going to increase hemoglobin, but you are going to target buffering capacity and glycolytic enzyme activity. So, if your event is basically sprint training or resistance training like sports, this actually may help to a certain extent, especially resistance training, as if you think of the intermittent hypoxia method that draws some similarities to the BFR, blood flow restriction method, so there may be some value there. FYI, on the tents, most simulated hypobaric tents use nitrogen dilution to lower the O2, which actually is shown to reduce sleep quality. That's not good for training, so I would not recommend that. which, by the way, none of this at all works if you have low iron counts or you're anemic, so please check your iron levels before you even consider doing something like this. And of course, check with your doctor, of course, too. None of this is considered medical advice. Please check with your healthcare provider. All right, I'll see you in the next video.